Today we're going to talk about something that over 200 million people around the world are actively using, and yet very few truly understand its effects on the brain and body. I'm talking about marijuana, cannabis. Whether it's for relaxation, creativity, pain relief, or recreation, this plant has become part of culture, medicine, and controversy. But here's the question: what is it actually doing to your brain? To your motivation? Your memory? Your hormones? As a neuroscientist, I don't approach this conversation with judgment, only with data and evidence. Today, I'll take you deep into how THC and CBD interact with your brain's natural systems, how they can help, and how they can hurt. My goal is simple: to give you the tools to make informed decisions about your body, your mind, and your long-term health. Let's dive in. The human brain is an intricate network of billions of neurons, constantly communicating through electrical signals and chemical messengers. Among the many systems that regulate how we think, feel, and behave, there's one that remained largely hidden from science until the early 1990s: the endocannabinoid system. This system is fundamental to maintaining balance in the body, what we call homeostasis. It plays a crucial role in regulating mood, appetite, memory, sleep, immune response, and even how we perceive pain and stress. The discovery of this system began with efforts to understand how marijuana produces its effects. Scientists identified a compound in cannabis called tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, which is responsible for the plant's psychoactive effects, the high that users experience. But what was even more surprising was that our brain contains specific receptors that bind to THC. These receptors, CB1 and CB2, are not there to receive plant compounds. They exist because our bodies naturally produce their own cannabis-like chemicals, known as endocannabinoids. The most well-known among them is an anandamide, often referred to as the bliss molecule, a name derived from the Sanskrit word ananda, meaning joy or delight. Anandamide and other endocannabinoids act as neuromodulators. That means they don't initiate signals like typical neurotransmitters such as dopamine or serotonin. Instead, they fine-tune the communication between neurons. When a neuron releases a signal, endocannabinoids are synthesized on demand by the receiving neuron, not stored in vesicles like most neurotransmitters, and travel in the reverse direction to bind to CB1 receptors on the sending neuron. This unique process is called retrograde signaling, and it plays a vital role in preventing overstimulation in the brain. Essentially, the endocannabinoid system serves as a feedback loop that helps keep neural activity in check. It quiets excessive signaling, dampens inflammation, and ensures that systems like stress, emotion, pain perception, and appetite don't spiral out of balance. The CB1 receptors are densely concentrated in areas of the brain involved in cognition, memory, emotion, and motor coordination, particularly the hippocampus, amygdala, prefrontal cortex, basal ganglia, and cerebellum. These are the very regions that are most affected when someone uses cannabis, especially THC-rich strains. When THC enters the brain, it binds tightly to these CB1 receptors, overwhelming the delicate, self-regulating endocannabinoid system. This leads to altered perception, impaired memory, changes in motor control, and shifts in mood and motivation. In essence, THC hijacks a system that evolved to maintain stability, pushing it into states of artificial stimulation. Another important aspect to understand is that the endocannabinoid system is not just confined to the brain. CB2 receptors are found primarily in the immune system, and their activation helps regulate inflammation and immune function. This is part of the reason why cannabis has been explored as a potential treatment for autoimmune diseases, chronic inflammatory conditions, and even some cancers. However, the therapeutic potential comes with complexity. External cannabinoids like THC and CBD can have very different effects depending on the dose, the delivery method, and the individual's unique biology, including genetic variants in their own endocannabinoid system. What's fascinating is that this system seems to be highly responsive to environmental factors. Stress, diet, exercise, and sleep can all modulate the levels of endocannabinoids in the brain. For example, aerobic exercise increases levels of anandamide, which may be one reason why many people report a mood boost or runner's high after a workout, an effect previously attributed solely to endorphins. Chronic stress, on the other hand, can deplete endocannabinoid levels, leading to heightened anxiety, irritability, and cognitive dysfunction. So when we talk about cannabis use, recreational or medicinal, we are not introducing a foreign substance into the body in the same way we might with alcohol or synthetic drugs. Instead, we're amplifying or mimicking a system that's already deeply embedded in how our brain and body function. But just because something is natural doesn't mean it's without consequences. Overactivation of this system, especially during critical periods like adolescence, can rewire how the brain develops and responds to future experiences. It can interfere with memory consolidation, emotional regulation, and even long-term brain plasticity, the ability of the brain to adapt and learn. Understanding the endocannabinoid system isn't just the key to understanding how marijuana affects us, it's a window into the core mechanisms of health, balance, and adaptation. It's a field still in its infancy, yet it holds enormous potential for medicine, psychology, and our broader understanding of human biology. The real question we must ask isn't whether cannabis is good or bad, it's how, when, and in whom it interacts with this ancient and deeply personal system. When people talk about marijuana, they often lump all of its effects into one broad category: the high, the relaxation, the anxiety relief, or the potential medical benefits. But what many don't realize is that marijuana isn't a single compound, it's a complex plant made up of over 100 different cannabinoids, each with its own unique effect on the body and brain. Among these, two have been the most studied and talked about: THC, or tetrahydrocannabinol, and CBD, or cannabidiol. Understanding the difference between these two compounds is essential, because while they both come from the same plant, they interact with the brain and body in dramatically different ways. THC is the primary psychoactive compound in marijuana. It's the molecule that binds most strongly to the CB1 receptors in the brain, which are part of the endocannabinoid system. When THC activates these receptors, it causes a wide range of effects: euphoria, altered perception of time, changes in sensory perception, impairment in short-term memory, and a sense of relaxation or sedation. These effects are the result of THC mimicking the body's own endocannabinoids, particularly anandamide, but doing so with greater intensity and for longer periods of time. THC doesn't just gently nudge the system, it overwhelms it. That's why the psychoactive experience of THC can be so powerful. Depending on the dose, context, and individual biology, this experience can range from pleasurable and relaxing to disorienting and anxiety-provoking. CBD, by contrast, is non-psychoactive. It does not bind to CB1 receptors in the same way that THC does. In fact, it has a very low affinity for these receptors, and may even act as an indirect antagonist to them. This means that CBD can actually reduce or moderate some of the effects of THC, particularly the ones people find unpleasant, like anxiety, paranoia, or cognitive impairment. For example, when someone consumes a marijuana strain that has a high ratio of THC to CBD, the experience is more likely to be intense, euphoric, and possibly anxiety-inducing. But if the ratio is more balanced, with equal or higher amounts of CBD, the overall experience tends to be smoother, more calming, and less likely to produce paranoia. Beyond just their differences in how they bind to cannabinoid receptors, THC and CBD have different effects on other parts of the brain and body as well. THC, through CB1 activation, influences dopamine release, which is why it can produce a temporary sense of heightened pleasure and reward. This is part of what makes it potentially addictive over time. Repeated stimulation of the dopamine system can lead to changes in reward processing, motivation, and emotional regulation. CBD, on the other hand, interacts with a wide variety of other receptors, including serotonin receptors, TRPV1 receptors involved in pain signaling, and even GABA receptors, which help regulate anxiety and calm the nervous system. As a result, CBD has been explored as a treatment for a wide range of conditions: anxiety disorders, epilepsy, chronic pain, inflammation, and even psychosis. Another critical difference lies in how these compounds affect cognition and mental health. THC can impair attention, learning, and memory, particularly when used in high doses or over long periods of time. This is especially concerning in adolescents and young adults whose brains are still developing. CBD, however, does not appear to cause cognitive deficits, and some studies even suggest it may have neuroprotective effects. In fact, CBD is currently being studied for its potential to help treat neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, where inflammation and cell death play key roles in disease progression. It's also important to recognize that the way THC and CBD are consumed affects their behavior. When smoked or vaped, THC enters the bloodstream quickly and reaches peak concentrations in the brain within minutes. This fast delivery is part of why the effects hit so hard and so fast. Edibles, on the other hand, are metabolized by the liver, where THC is converted into a more potent form called 11-hydroxy-THC. This version is even more psychoactive, and it also takes longer to kick in, which can lead to unintentional overconsumption and a much more intense, sometimes overwhelming experience. CBD, while also absorbed through the lungs or digestive tract, behaves differently. It's more stable and doesn't undergo the same psychoactive transformation. Its effects are more gradual, more subtle, and often more therapeutic than recreational. The interaction between THC and CBD isn't just pharmacological, it's also psychological. In studies where participants were given both THC and CBD, the presence of CBD consistently reduced the negative emotional effects of THC. It didn't block the high completely, but it did seem to smooth the edges, lowering anxiety, paranoia, and emotional volatility. This balancing effect has led to a surge of interest in cannabis strains and products that are rich in CBD, particularly for users who want some of the mood-enhancing or pain-relieving properties of cannabis, without the mental fog or anxiety that can come from high THC strains. Finally, there's an important social and medical context to consider. In much of the commercial marijuana market today, especially in recreational dispensaries, there's been a trend toward developing strains with extremely high THC concentrations, sometimes upwards of 20 to 30% or more, and very little CBD. This wasn't always the case. Historically, cannabis strains were much more balanced in their THC to CBD ratios, but modern cultivation techniques have selectively bred plants to maximize potency, often at the expense of safety and cognitive balance. The result is a market full of products that are far more powerful, and potentially more harmful, than what previous generations used. Understanding the difference between THC and CBD, then, is not just about knowing which compound makes you high. It's about recognizing how these molecules interact with your brain's natural systems, how they influence cognition, emotion, and behavior, and how they can either support or disrupt the delicate balance of your body's neurochemistry. One is a powerful psychoactive compound that can both elevate and impair. The other is a gentle modulator with broad therapeutic potential. Together they form a complex chemical dialogue, and our job as informed individuals is to learn how to listen. One of the most consistently documented and scientifically verified effects of marijuana, particularly its psychoactive compound THC, is its impact on memory and learning. This is not simply a temporary side effect like drowsiness or dry mouth. THC directly alters the way memory is processed in the brain, and depending on the age of the user, the dosage, the frequency of use, and the duration of exposure, these changes can have lasting consequences. At the heart of this issue is the brain's hippocampus, a seahorse-shaped structure located deep within the temporal lobe. The hippocampus is essential for encoding and retrieving memories. It helps us learn new information, store it in a way that allows for later access, and connect it to context, emotion, and spatial awareness. When THC enters the bloodstream and reaches the brain, it binds with a high affinity to CB1 receptors, which are densely packed in the hippocampus. This interaction disrupts the delicate balance of neurotransmitters and neuromodulators responsible for memory consolidation. THC doesn't just mildly affect memory, it actively impairs the hippocampus's ability to encode new information. When someone is under the influence of THC, their short-term memory becomes less reliable. They may struggle to hold on to new information, follow complex conversations, or recall what was said just moments ago. This is why cannabis users often describe moments of forgetfulness during use, like walking into a room and not remembering why, or losing track of a thought mid-sentence. These disruptions aren't merely anecdotal, they're reflected in controlled laboratory studies showing clear deficits in memory formation and working memory among cannabis users, especially when under the acute effects of THC. What makes this particularly concerning is the distinction between acute and chronic effects. Acute effects refer to the impairments that occur while under the influence of THC, which usually dissipate after the drug wears off. But with frequent or heavy use, the brain begins to adapt. This adaptation can lead to long-term changes in the structure and function of the hippocampus. Neuroimaging studies have found that chronic marijuana users, especially those who started in adolescence, often have smaller hippocampal volumes compared to non-users. The neurons in these regions may lose their connectivity, and the overall architecture of this memory center becomes less efficient. These changes are associated with measurable deficits in memory performance, even during periods of abstinence. Adolescents are particularly vulnerable to these effects. The teenage brain is in a critical phase of development, with the hippocampus undergoing significant structural refinement and connectivity expansion. Introducing THC during this sensitive window can interfere with the natural maturation of brain circuits involved in learning, attention, and memory. The result is not just short-term forgetfulness, but potentially enduring difficulties with academic performance, information retention, and even emotional regulation, since the hippocampus is also involved in contextualizing emotion-laden memories. The earlier and more frequently someone uses marijuana, the more pronounced these effects tend to be. Moreover, the disruption in memory caused by THC isn't isolated to the hippocampus. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for higher-order cognitive functions like planning, decision-making, and focused attention, also has CB1 receptors and is affected by THC. This region works in tandem with the hippocampus to support working memory, the ability to hold and manipulate information in real time. Under the influence of THC, this system becomes sluggish. Tasks that require mental flexibility, organization, or sustained concentration become more difficult. This is why students, professionals, or anyone needing to retain and apply new information often experience performance dips when using cannabis regularly. In addition to these cognitive concerns, there's also the issue of state-dependent memory. This phenomenon refers to the fact that memories formed while under the influence of a substance may be more difficult to retrieve when sober. Conversely, people may find that they remember certain events or pieces of information better when they are once again under the influence. This fragmentation of memory further disrupts the continuity and reliability of mental function, making it harder to integrate experiences and knowledge across different states of consciousness. There is also growing concern about how these memory impairments intersect with mental health. Individuals with anxiety, depression, PTSD, or other psychiatric conditions often turn to cannabis for temporary relief. However, if cannabis use impairs memory consolidation, especially of emotional experiences, it can interfere with therapeutic progress, personal insight, and long-term emotional healing. For example, one might feel temporarily less anxious, but over time fail to integrate the coping strategies or behavioral patterns that therapy or personal reflection offers, simply because the brain is less able to retain and apply those lessons. Finally, although much of the research has focused on the impairing effects of THC on memory, there is an important nuance: not all cannabis compounds have the same effect. CBD, for instance, does not impair memory, and may even counteract some of the disruptive effects of THC on the hippocampus. This is why strains with a more balanced ratio of THC to CBD are often better tolerated cognitively than those with extremely high THC concentrations. But unfortunately, modern cannabis products, especially those in the recreational market, tend to favor extremely high THC levels with very little CBD, maximizing the potential for memory-related side effects. In the broader picture, memory is not just about storing facts or recalling what we had for lunch yesterday. Memory is deeply tied to our identity, our ability to make decisions, and our connection to past experiences. It shapes how we learn from mistakes, how we build relationships, and how we navigate the world. When a substance like THC repeatedly interferes with this process, it can have ripple effects across nearly every domain of life. This is why understanding and respecting the impact of marijuana on memory and learning is not just a scientific concern, it's a deeply human one. When we think about marijuana, many people associate it with a sense of calm, a way to unwind or take the edge off a stressful day. And while this calming effect can certainly be real for some users, especially at lower doses, the relationship between marijuana and mental health, particularly anxiety and depression, is far more complex and at times contradictory. One of the most misunderstood aspects of marijuana use is its paradoxical effect on mood and emotional regulation. While some individuals report a reduction in anxiety, tension, or depressive symptoms after using cannabis, others experience intense anxiety, paranoia, or even panic attacks. This duality is not random, it's rooted in how cannabis compounds like THC and CBD interact with key brain systems involved in mood regulation. The brain's limbic system, which includes structures like the amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex, plays a central role in processing emotions, including fear, threat detection, and emotional memory. This system is rich in cannabinoid receptors, particularly CB1 receptors, which THC binds to with high affinity. When THC activates these receptors in the amygdala, the brain's fear and threat detection center, it can alter the way the brain interprets emotional signals. In some people, this leads to a blunted stress response, a sense of ease, and a reduction in perceived anxiety. but in others, especially at higher doses, the opposite occurs. The amygdala becomes hyperactive, sensitivity to internal sensations increases, and users may begin to feel overwhelmed, threatened, or panicked even in safe environments. This is one of the reasons why cannabis-induced anxiety is often described as coming out of nowhere. Physiologically, what's happening is that THC increases heart rate and can heighten awareness of bodily sensations. For someone already prone to anxiety or panic, this internal amplification can trigger a cascade of anxious thoughts and physical symptoms. They might begin to worry about their heart rate, misinterpret harmless sensations as signs of danger, or feel trapped in their own body. This is not just psychological, it's a neurochemical chain reaction set in motion by THC's effect on the autonomic nervous system and limbic circuitry. Depression presents another complicated interaction with cannabis. Some people use marijuana to escape feelings of sadness, hopelessness, or emotional numbness. THC can temporarily increase dopamine release, which gives a short-lived mood boost and a feeling of reward or pleasure. But the problem lies in the pattern of this use. Over time, chronic stimulation of the brain's dopamine system can lead to downregulation, meaning the brain becomes less responsive to natural sources of pleasure. This is the same mechanism seen in many addictive substances. The result is that a person may become more reliant on cannabis just to feel normal, while their baseline mood continues to decline. This contributes to what is known as cannabis-induced demotivation, where individuals feel lethargic, disengaged, and emotionally flat over time. Moreover, studies have shown that long-term cannabis use, particularly in individuals with a genetic or familial predisposition to mood disorders, can increase the risk of developing depression. It's not that cannabis causes depression in everyone, it's that for some individuals, especially those already vulnerable, due to their biology or life circumstances, cannabis may exacerbate or accelerate underlying mood dysfunction. Adolescents and young adults are particularly at risk, not just because their brains are still developing, but because early cannabis use can alter the trajectory of emotional development. It can interfere with the maturation of prefrontal circuits involved in emotional regulation, impulse control, and coping skills, making it harder for young users to build resilience to life's challenges. An additional layer to this is the role of CBD. Unlike THC, CBD has been shown in several studies to have anxiolytic, anxiety-reducing, and antidepressant-like effects. It interacts with serotonin receptors and helps regulate the body's stress response without producing intoxication or paranoia. In fact, many people who experience anxiety from THC find relief when they switch to CBD-dominant strains or isolate products. However, because of market trends that favor high THC, low CBD strains, especially in recreational markets, many users aren't getting the benefits of CBD and are instead consuming products that may worsen their mental health symptoms over time. There's also a feedback loop that can occur. Someone uses cannabis to relieve anxiety or sadness, but over time their tolerance increases. They need more to achieve the same effect, and higher doses increase the likelihood of negative emotional responses. If they try to stop using, they may experience a rebound in anxiety, irritability, and mood instability due to withdrawal symptoms. This can make it feel like cannabis is the only thing keeping them emotionally stable, reinforcing dependence. But in reality, the substance may be masking or even contributing to the very symptoms it's being used to treat. The social and psychological environment in which cannabis is used also plays a role. If someone uses it in a safe, relaxed setting with trusted people, they're more likely to experience positive emotional effects. But in unfamiliar, overstimulating, or stressful settings, cannabis can amplify insecurity and emotional volatility. This contextual sensitivity underscores just how complex the interaction between cannabis and mental health truly is. Understanding this complexity is essential not just for users, but for healthcare providers, educators, and policymakers. It's not accurate or helpful to label cannabis as either a cure-all or a dangerous drug. Its effects on mental health are deeply individualized, shaped by genetics, neurobiology, dosage, frequency, and context. For some, it may offer short-term relief. For others, it may deepen emotional struggles and make recovery more difficult. Recognizing and respecting this dual potential is key to making informed, balanced decisions about its use. Only by acknowledging both the relief and the risks can we navigate the emotional terrain of cannabis with clarity and responsibility.
The adolescent brain is undergoing one of the most critical periods of development in the human lifespan. During this time, the brain is not just growing in size, it is fundamentally reorganizing itself. Neural pathways are being refined, unused connections are being pruned away, and areas involved in executive function, emotional regulation, and decision-making, particularly the prefrontal cortex, are developing at a rapid pace. It's a period of remarkable neuroplasticity, but also profound vulnerability. Introducing marijuana during this stage, especially forms of marijuana that are high in THC, can interfere with this developmental trajectory in ways that are not always immediately apparent but may carry long-term consequences. One of the key features of adolescence is the dynamic between two competing systems in the brain: the limbic system, which drives emotions and reward-seeking behavior, and the prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control, planning, and judgment. In adolescence, the limbic system matures earlier than the prefrontal cortex. This imbalance explains much of teenage behavior, the desire for novelty, risk-taking, and heightened sensitivity to peer influence. When THC is introduced into this already imbalanced system, it can disrupt the fine-tuned neurochemical signaling necessary for healthy development. THC binds to CB1 receptors, which are found throughout the brain, including in high concentrations in the prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, and amygdala, all areas involved in emotional processing, memory, and cognitive control. What makes adolescent marijuana use particularly concerning is that these CB1 receptors are not just passively present, they play an active role in guiding neural development. They help regulate processes such as synaptic pruning, the removal of unnecessary neural connections to make the brain more efficient, and neurogenesis, the creation of new neurons, particularly in the hippocampus. When THC repeatedly binds to these receptors, it can hijack or alter the timing and direction of these developmental processes. Instead of pruning the right connections or strengthening the ones needed for adult-level cognitive functioning, the brain's natural development can be derailed or delayed. Numerous studies have shown that adolescents who use marijuana regularly, especially those who start before the age of 16, are more likely to show deficits in memory, attention, and executive function later in life. Even after periods of abstinence, these cognitive deficits can persist, suggesting that the changes to the brain are not just temporary. Structural brain imaging has revealed differences in the volume and integrity of the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus among adolescent users, compared to non-users. Functional MRI scans show altered patterns of brain activity during tasks involving working memory or emotional regulation. These are not subtle changes, they represent a measurable deviation from the normative developmental trajectory. Behaviorally, these neurological changes can manifest in a range of ways. Teenagers who use marijuana heavily may struggle more in school, not just because of lack of motivation, although that can be a factor, but because their brains are less equipped to retain new information, focus on complex tasks, and plan ahead. They may become more emotionally reactive, less able to manage stress, and more impulsive in their decision-making. These traits are already challenges for adolescents, but marijuana can intensify them, making it harder for young people to navigate the demands of academic, social, and family life. Another area of concern is the relationship between adolescent marijuana use and the risk of developing psychiatric disorders. There is growing evidence that early and heavy marijuana use increases the likelihood of developing anxiety, depression, and even psychosis, especially in individuals who have a genetic predisposition. For example, some genetic variations in dopamine or cannabinoid receptor genes can increase susceptibility to the negative effects of THC. In these individuals, marijuana doesn't just interfere with brain development, it may act as a catalyst, triggering psychiatric conditions that might have otherwise remained dormant or less severe. The earlier the use begins, and the more frequently and heavily marijuana is used, the greater the risk appears to be. Part of what makes this so difficult to address is that many adolescents perceive marijuana as harmless, especially compared to other substances like alcohol or tobacco. With increasing legalization and social acceptance, the stigma once associated with marijuana has diminished, but so too has the perceived risk. Teenagers often consume products that are far more potent than the cannabis of past generations. High THC concentrates like wax, shatter, or vape oils can deliver doses of THC that are many times stronger than traditional flower. These products, marketed with flavors and packaging that appeal to younger audiences, can flood the adolescent brain with psychoactive chemicals at a time when it is least equipped to handle them. It's also important to consider that adolescence is a time of identity formation and emotional development. Marijuana use can blunt emotional experiences, making it harder for young people to engage deeply with their thoughts, form meaningful connections, or learn from emotional challenges. Emotional resilience, the ability to face discomfort and grow from it, is built through experience and effort, but when marijuana is used as an emotional escape, it can short-circuit this process. Teens who rely on marijuana to cope with stress, boredom, or social anxiety may fail to develop healthy coping mechanisms, leaving them more vulnerable to emotional instability later in life. The impact of marijuana on motivation is another issue of debate, especially in adolescence. While not everyone who uses marijuana becomes unmotivated, there is a pattern seen in some users, particularly heavy daily users, where interest in goals, responsibilities, and personal development begins to wane. This phenomenon, sometimes referred to as a motivational syndrome, is especially problematic during adolescence, when young people are supposed to be discovering their passions, building their skills, and setting the stage for adulthood. THC's effects on dopamine pathways may dull the drive to pursue long-term goals, leading to a cycle of disengagement and underachievement. Ultimately, the adolescent brain is like a foundation being poured for a building. If the foundation is disturbed or weakened during construction, the stability of the entire structure may be compromised. Marijuana, particularly when used heavily and early in life, has the potential to affect that foundation in subtle but meaningful ways. The consequences may not always be immediate or dramatic, but over time they can shape the arc of a person's life, influencing their mental health, academic achievement, emotional regulation, and capacity for resilience. This is not about fear-mongering or demonizing cannabis, but about acknowledging that timing matters. The adolescent brain is a remarkable, powerful, and sensitive system, one that deserves to be protected during its most formative years. The endocannabinoid system is one of the most fascinating and essential systems in the human body, yet it remains one of the least understood by the general public. This system is not some obscure biological mechanism. It is deeply integrated into nearly every major physiological process, playing a key role in maintaining balance, or what scientists refer to as homeostasis. It helps regulate mood, appetite, pain sensation, immune response, sleep, memory, and even how we experience stress. In essence, the endocannabinoid system acts like a conductor of a massive orchestra, helping different bodily systems stay in harmony with one another. When marijuana is introduced into the body, particularly its psychoactive component THC, it directly interacts with this system, and not always in a way that supports its natural balance. To understand the interaction between marijuana and the endocannabinoid system, it helps to first understand how the system operates. The human body naturally produces its own cannabinoids, called endocannabinoids, that act like chemical messengers. These messengers bind to cannabinoid receptors, primarily CB1 and CB2, located throughout the brain and body. CB1 receptors are heavily concentrated in the brain and central nervous system, where they influence functions like mood, memory, and motor control. CB2 receptors are more prevalent in the immune system and peripheral organs, playing a significant role in inflammation and immune responses. Endocannabinoids are produced on demand. They are synthesized when and where they are needed, used to fine-tune responses to stimuli, and then broken down quickly. This tight regulation allows the endocannabinoid system to act with precision, responding moment to moment to internal and external conditions. However, when THC from marijuana is introduced, it floods the system and binds strongly to CB1 receptors, essentially mimicking the body's natural endocannabinoids, but with much greater potency and duration. THC doesn't follow the same rules. It doesn't get broken down as efficiently, it doesn't target receptors with the same selectivity, and it can overstimulate the system in ways the body was not designed to handle. This overstimulation can lead to disruptions in normal physiological processes. For example, in the brain, where CB1 receptors are densely located in areas like the hippocampus, cerebellum, and prefrontal cortex, THC's binding can alter mood, impair memory, and affect coordination and judgment. Over time, repeated exposure to high levels of THC can cause the body to downregulate its own cannabinoid receptors in an effort to restore balance. Essentially, the brain tries to compensate by reducing the number of receptors, or by making them less sensitive. This adaptation can reduce the effectiveness of the endocannabinoid system, even when THC is no longer present. When the system is downregulated, natural endocannabinoids can no longer function as effectively. This can lead to a variety of problems, including decreased ability to regulate mood, increased pain sensitivity, poor stress response, and difficulty maintaining motivation. This is one reason why chronic marijuana users may feel emotionally flat, less resilient to stress, or physically uncomfortable during periods of abstinence. Their endocannabinoid system, which once maintained balance, has been temporarily thrown off kilter and needs time to recalibrate. Another consequence of chronic THC exposure is its impact on reward processing. The endocannabinoid system interacts closely with the brain's dopamine system, the system responsible for pleasure, motivation, and reward. THC can increase dopamine release in the short term, which is part of why marijuana can produce feelings of euphoria or relaxation. But with repeated use, this interaction can desensitize the brain's reward circuits. The result is that natural pleasures, like food, exercise, social connection, or achievement, may become less rewarding. Users may begin to rely more on marijuana to experience pleasure or relief, creating a feedback loop of dependence and reduced natural motivation.
The interaction with CB2 receptors also has significant implications, particularly for immune function. While less is known about the long-term effects of marijuana on the immune system, research suggests that THC's binding to CB2 receptors can modulate immune cell activity, sometimes suppressing immune responses. This could explain why some studies have found altered immune function in chronic users. The extent and clinical significance of this are still being explored, but it underscores that marijuana's effects go far beyond the brain. It touches virtually every system in the body through the endocannabinoid network. It's also important to recognize that not all cannabinoids act the same way. CBD, another major compound found in cannabis, interacts with the endocannabinoid system quite differently from THC. It does not bind strongly to CB1 or CB2 receptors, but appears to modulate them indirectly. CBD can enhance the body's own endocannabinoid tone by inhibiting the enzyme that breaks down anandamide, one of the body's natural cannabinoids. This may explain why CBD has been associated with anti-anxiety, anti-inflammatory, and neuroprotective effects without producing intoxication. In contrast to THC, CBD seems to support the balance of the endocannabinoid system rather than overwhelming it. However, modern marijuana strains have been bred to contain increasingly high levels of THC and often very low levels of CBD. This imbalance can make the effects on the endocannabinoid system more extreme and more disruptive, particularly when marijuana is used frequently or in large amounts. The original medicinal potential of cannabis, which was tied to a more balanced ratio of cannabinoids, has in many cases been replaced by products designed for maximum psychoactive effect, with less consideration for how they might impact the body's natural regulatory systems over time. What makes this entire issue more profound is that the endocannabinoid system is not just a passive receptor system for cannabis, it is a master regulator of internal balance. When marijuana, especially high-potency THC products, is used in a way that overwhelms or hijacks this system, it can distort the body's ability to regulate itself. The result is not just a temporary high or low, but a shift in how the brain and body function at a fundamental level. The good news is that the endocannabinoid system is resilient. It can recover with time, abstinence, and lifestyle choices that support its function, such as exercise, proper sleep, and stress management. But understanding the depth of its influence is essential for anyone considering regular cannabis use, especially when the goal is long-term physical, emotional, and cognitive well-being. One of the most widely reported and scientifically supported effects of marijuana use is its impact on short-term memory. This isn't just a temporary forgetfulness or occasional lapse. THC, the primary psychoactive compound in marijuana, has a direct and measurable effect on how new information is encoded, stored, and retrieved by the brain. When someone consumes marijuana, especially forms high in THC, the ability to form new memories can be significantly impaired. This happens because of the way THC interacts with specific areas of the brain, particularly the hippocampus, a region that plays a critical role in the formation and consolidation of short-term memories into long-term storage. The hippocampus contains a high density of CB1 receptors, which are the primary docking sites for THC in the brain. These receptors are essential for the proper functioning of synaptic transmission, the way neurons communicate with each other to form memories. When THC binds to these receptors, it disrupts the normal flow of information between neurons. Instead of allowing for smooth communication and encoding of experience, THC causes a kind of neural interference. The result is that the brain struggles to retain what just happened or what was just learned. This is why someone who is under the influence of marijuana might forget what they were saying mid-sentence, misplace objects repeatedly,
or have difficulty following multi-step instructions even moments after hearing them. This impairment doesn't just affect casual conversation or daily routines, it has meaningful implications for learning and performance in academic, professional, and social contexts. For students, for example, using marijuana regularly can make it significantly harder to study effectively or retain what they've learned. Even if they feel alert or functional, the brain's capacity to encode that information for future retrieval is compromised. It's not simply about being high at the time of study. The changes in memory processing can persist beyond the immediate intoxication, particularly with chronic or heavy use. Studies have shown that frequent marijuana users often perform worse on tests of verbal memory, attention span, and executive function, even after a period of abstinence. What's particularly concerning is that these impairments can become more pronounced with sustained use over time. The brain, especially when it is young and still developing, adapts to repeated exposure by changing its internal wiring, what neuroscientists refer to as neuroplasticity. In the context of frequent THC exposure, this plasticity can work against the user, creating long-lasting alterations in memory-related structures and pathways. Imaging studies have revealed differences in the size and function of the hippocampus among chronic users compared to non-users. These structural differences often correlate with measurable declines in memory performance. In other words, marijuana doesn't just change how memory works temporarily, it may also reshape the very architecture of the brain in ways that affect memory long-term. It's also important to note that not all types of memory are equally affected. THC's influence is most profound on short-term and working memory, the systems responsible for holding information in our minds for brief periods while we use or manipulate it. This type of memory is crucial for reasoning, problem-solving, and learning new skills. When working memory is impaired, tasks that require mental flexibility, quick recall, or attention to detail become significantly more difficult. Long-term memory, which is more about the storage and retrieval of past experiences or facts learned over time, is generally less affected by a single instance of use, but can still be negatively impacted with chronic exposure. The impact on memory is often dose-dependent, meaning that the more THC consumed, and the more frequently it is consumed, the more severe the impairment tends to be. In the current landscape of cannabis use, this is especially relevant because many modern cannabis products contain significantly higher concentrations of THC than what was available in past decades. Vape oils, edibles, dabs, and concentrates can deliver levels of THC that are many times stronger than traditional cannabis flower. These high-potency products can have a more intense and prolonged effect on the memory systems of the brain, even with less frequent use. Moreover, when marijuana is consumed through edibles, the effects can be more delayed and unpredictable. This can lead users to ingest more than intended, resulting in higher levels of THC in the bloodstream and more significant cognitive effects. Unlike smoking or vaping, where the onset is rapid and users can titrate their dose more easily, edibles can lead to a delayed but overwhelming experience that leaves the user deeply impaired in memory and cognition for hours. The memory effects of marijuana also have psychological implications. Memory is tightly connected to our sense of self and continuity, how we understand our personal history, how we learn from experience, and how we maintain a coherent narrative of our lives. When short-term memory is consistently impaired, it can become difficult to form new memories that shape that narrative. Over time, this can lead to a feeling of disconnection, a sense that events are slipping away, or that one is mentally foggy or unanchored. This experience can contribute to lower productivity, reduced self-confidence, and even emotional flattening, as the richness and continuity of experience are diminished. The good news is that many of the memory impairments associated with marijuana are at least partially reversible with sustained abstinence. The brain has an incredible capacity for recovery, especially if the individual is otherwise healthy and supports brain function through sleep, nutrition, exercise, and mental engagement. However, the extent of recovery often depends on how long and how heavily marijuana was used, as well as the age at which use began. Younger users, whose brains are still developing, may face a longer road to full cognitive restoration, particularly if use began early in adolescence. In sum, the interaction between marijuana and memory is not a vague or abstract concern. It is a direct and well-documented effect that influences daily life in measurable ways. From school performance to emotional stability, from learning new skills to retaining meaningful life experiences, memory plays a central role in human functioning. Marijuana, particularly THC-heavy varieties, can interfere with that role in ways that users may not fully realize until they notice a consistent pattern of forgetfulness, cognitive fuzziness, or diminished learning ability. Understanding this relationship empowers individuals to make informed decisions about when, how, and whether to use cannabis, especially if optimal brain performance is important to them. One of the lesser discussed yet deeply impactful effects of marijuana use is its influence on emotional regulation. At first glance, marijuana may appear to help with emotions. It's often used for relaxation, stress relief, or simply to take the edge off a long day. In the short term, it can dampen the intensity of emotional responses, producing feelings of calm or even euphoria. However, over time, repeated marijuana use, especially high THC strains, can interfere with the brain's natural ability to regulate emotions effectively. This can create a situation where emotions either feel blunted and flat, or paradoxically, more unstable and difficult to manage.
Emotional regulation is a complex function involving several regions of the brain, primarily the prefrontal cortex, amygdala, and hippocampus. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and assessing emotional responses in a rational context. The amygdala processes emotional stimuli, particularly fear and anxiety, while the hippocampus ties emotional responses to memories. All of these regions are rich in CB1 receptors, which are the targets of THC, the main psychoactive compound in marijuana. When THC binds to these receptors, it alters the way these brain regions communicate and function. Initially, THC can dampen activity in the amygdala, leading to a reduction in the perception of threat or stress. This is part of why marijuana can feel calming and anxiolytic, like the emotional volume is being turned down. But this artificial modulation of the brain's threat detection system can create imbalances. Over time, the brain adapts to repeated THC exposure by altering receptor sensitivity and neurotransmitter levels. This adaptation can lead to a situation where, in the absence of marijuana, the emotional system is either underactive, resulting in emotional numbness, or overreactive, leading to heightened anxiety, irritability, or depressive symptoms. Chronic marijuana use has been associated with an increased risk of developing mood disorders, especially in those who are genetically predisposed or began using at a young age. The disruption of normal endocannabinoid function can impair the brain's natural emotional resilience, making it harder to bounce back from setbacks or regulate internal emotional states without the aid of the drug. In some users, marijuana becomes a primary coping mechanism, which might provide temporary relief, but ultimately prevents the development of healthy, more adaptive emotional regulation strategies. This reliance can mask underlying emotional difficulties, delaying their resolution and in some cases exacerbating them. Another important aspect to consider is the emotional flattening that some frequent users report. While marijuana can dull emotional pain or anxiety, it can also dull positive emotions, joy, enthusiasm, motivation, and love. Over time, the range of emotional experience may narrow, creating a kind of psychological monotone. This flattening is not necessarily accompanied by awareness. Users might not notice the change until they take a break and begin to feel emotions with more intensity and depth. This shift can be jarring but also enlightening, highlighting just how much marijuana had been muting their internal emotional landscape. Marijuana's effects on emotion are also deeply connected to its impact on memory and motivation. Emotional experiences are often encoded into memory, helping us learn from the past and adjust our behavior in the future. If memory formation is impaired, emotional processing is also disrupted. Similarly, when motivation is reduced, individuals may avoid emotionally challenging situations or conversations, further limiting emotional growth. This pattern can lead to emotional stagnation or even regression, especially in young users who are still developing their identity and emotional maturity. There is also a social dimension to emotional regulation and marijuana use. Emotion is not just an internal experience, it's a form of communication. Our ability to read, respond to, and share emotions with others is fundamental to relationships.
Marijuana can interfere with this social emotional exchange. Users may misinterpret social cues, respond inappropriately to emotional expressions, or withdraw from emotionally engaging interactions. Over time, this can lead to social isolation or strained relationships, which in turn affect emotional well-being. Emotional health thrives in the context of meaningful human connection, and marijuana, when overused, can subtly erode these connections. On the neurochemical level, THC alters the balance of neurotransmitters that are essential for emotional regulation, including dopamine and serotonin. While THC can increase dopamine temporarily, chronic use can lead to dysregulation of the dopamine system, contributing to anhedonia, a reduced ability to experience pleasure. Similarly, alterations in serotonin signaling can affect mood stability, increasing the risk of anxiety and depression. These changes are not just theoretical, they have been observed in brain imaging studies and are often reported subjectively by long-term users who notice emotional instability or a loss of emotional depth. It's worth noting that these effects are not experienced equally by all users. Some individuals are more sensitive to THC's emotional effects due to genetic, psychological, or developmental factors. Adolescents, for example, are particularly vulnerable because their brains are still developing. Exposure to THC during this critical period can have lasting consequences on emotional development, potentially increasing the risk of emotional dysregulation well into adulthood. Even for adult users, the cumulative impact of regular marijuana use on emotional health can be significant, especially when use becomes habitual or compulsive. Importantly, emotional dysregulation associated with marijuana use is often reversible. With sustained abstinence, many individuals report a return of emotional clarity, improved mood stability, and a greater capacity to feel and process emotions naturally. This recovery can be supported by practices that promote emotional resilience, such as therapy, mindfulness, regular physical activity, and meaningful social interaction. The key is awareness, recognizing the role that marijuana may be playing in emotional life, and being willing to make changes if emotional health is being compromised. In the broader context, understanding how marijuana affects emotional regulation is not about demonizing the substance, it's about equipping people with knowledge. For many, marijuana may serve a role in temporary stress relief or relaxation. But when it becomes a chronic tool for emotional management, it can undermine the very emotional balance it initially seemed to support. By examining the nuanced ways in which THC interacts with the emotional brain, we gain deeper insight into how to use or avoid it consciously, particularly when long-term emotional stability and personal growth are at stake. Marijuana's impact on coordination and reaction time is one of the most immediate and noticeable effects it has on the human body. Within minutes of THC entering the bloodstream, users often experience a sense of altered bodily awareness, a feeling that movement is slower, reflexes are dulled, and physical coordination becomes less precise. This is not a matter of perception alone, it's backed by well-established neuroscience. THC interferes with several brain regions responsible for motor control, timing, and sensory motor integration, leading to a measurable decline in one's ability to perform tasks that require quick responses and coordinated movement. Central to this effect is the cerebellum, a structure located at the base of the brain, which is heavily involved in fine motor skills, balance, and coordination. The cerebellum contains a high concentration of CB1 receptors, the primary target of THC. When THC binds to these receptors, it disrupts the normal function of the cerebellum, leading to a kind of neural noise that interferes with the brain's ability to send clear, accurate signals to the muscles. This disruption affects both gross motor movements, such as walking or running, and fine motor skills, such as writing, typing, or even simply picking up small objects. It creates a situation where movements may feel sluggish, imprecise, or exaggerated, and where maintaining balance or posture becomes more difficult. The basal ganglia, another group of brain structures involved in movement control, are also affected by THC. These structures help initiate and regulate voluntary movements, and contribute to the timing and sequencing of actions. When their function is altered by marijuana, users may experience a delay between intention and action. For example, the decision to step over an object or reach for a door handle may be followed by a noticeable lag before the body responds. This lag can be dangerous in real-world scenarios, particularly when operating a vehicle or machinery, where split-second decisions and precise movements can be the difference between safety and harm. One of the most critical concerns surrounding marijuana's effects on coordination and reaction time is its impact on driving. Numerous studies have demonstrated that THC impairs driving ability by reducing attentiveness, slowing reaction time, and distorting spatial awareness. Drivers under the influence of marijuana are more likely to drift between lanes, misjudge distances, and react too slowly to unexpected obstacles or changes in traffic flow. Unlike alcohol, which may lead to more aggressive or risk-taking behavior, marijuana tends to make drivers overcompensate by driving more slowly. However, this does not offset the danger. Slower reactions still pose serious risks, especially in complex driving environments. What makes the situation even more complex is that users often underestimate their level of impairment. Because marijuana can induce a sense of calm or even hyper-awareness, individuals may feel in control, even when their motor and cognitive faculties are compromised. This discrepancy between subjective experience and objective performance is part of what makes marijuana-related accidents particularly insidious. People often don't realize they're impaired until they are confronted with a task that demands rapid, coordinated responses, and by then, it may be too late. Reaction time in particular is influenced by how quickly the brain can process incoming information, assess its meaning, and initiate an appropriate physical response. THC slows down each of these steps. Visual information, for instance, takes longer to register and be interpreted. The delay in processing affects not just physical reactions but decision-making as well. Someone under the influence of marijuana may hesitate before making a choice, respond inappropriately, or fail to respond at all in time-sensitive situations. This slowed processing is critical in activities like sports, emergency responses, or even everyday tasks such as walking in a crowded area or crossing a street. Furthermore, the impact on coordination is not uniform. It can vary based on dosage, method of consumption, individual tolerance, and whether marijuana is used in combination with other substances. High-potency products like dabs, vape oils, or edibles can lead to significantly more impairment than traditional cannabis flower, especially because the effects of edibles can come on slowly and unpredictably. A user might feel fine at first, then experience a sudden and overwhelming loss of motor control once the THC kicks in fully. This unpredictability increases the risk of accidents, falls, or other coordination-related mishaps. It's also important to consider the long-term effects on motor function in habitual users. While occasional use may lead to temporary impairments that wear off as the drug leaves the system, chronic use has been associated with more persistent changes in motor performance. These changes may not be dramatic, but can include slight reductions in balance, timing, and precision. In certain populations, such as adolescents or older adults, even small declines in coordination can have meaningful consequences. Young people may find their athletic performance deteriorating, or their ability to engage in complex motor learning hampered, while older adults may face increased risk of falls or injuries due to impaired balance and slowed reflexes.
The interaction between marijuana and physical performance is further complicated by the user's psychological state. THC can increase self-consciousness or induce mild anxiety, both of which can interfere with the fluid execution of movements. A person who is worried about looking impaired may become hyper-aware of their body, overthinking each movement and thereby disrupting the automatic coordination that typically governs our actions. This kind of self-conscious interference can further slow response time and reduce overall physical effectiveness, especially in socially or professionally demanding situations. Recovery from marijuana's impairing effects on coordination and reaction time generally occurs as the drug is metabolized and leaves the body, but the timeline varies. THC can remain in the system for hours, especially with potent products or in individuals with high body fat content, since THC is fat soluble. This means the return to full physical clarity may take longer than anticipated, and residual impairment can persist even after the user no longer feels high. For tasks requiring high performance or safety, erring on the side of caution is essential. Waiting longer than one might think necessary is often the wiser choice.
Ultimately, marijuana's impact on coordination and reaction time underscores the importance of context and self-awareness in its use. While some users may choose to consume in environments where physical performance isn't critical, understanding the neurobiological consequences empowers individuals to make informed decisions. Whether it's the delay in reacting to a sudden stop on the road, the loss of balance during a hike, or the impaired dexterity during a task requiring precision, these are not abstract risks. They're real, observable, and preventable. Appreciating the science behind these effects allows for a more responsible and conscious approach to marijuana use, especially when safety, performance, or the well-being of others is on the line. Another important aspect to consider when discussing marijuana's effects on the brain and body is its potential for addiction and dependency. While marijuana is often perceived as less addictive than substances like alcohol, nicotine, or opioids, this does not mean it is free from risk. In fact, the nature of marijuana's addictive potential is complex and nuanced, involving both psychological and physiological components that can develop over time with regular use. Understanding how and why marijuana can lead to dependency is crucial, especially as its legal status changes in many parts of the world and its use becomes more widespread. The addictive potential of marijuana primarily stems from its interaction with the brain's reward system. The brain is wired to respond to pleasurable stimuli through the release of dopamine, a neurotransmitter that signals reward and reinforces behaviors necessary for survival, such as eating and social bonding. THC, the active compound in marijuana, stimulates the release of dopamine in certain brain regions, particularly the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area, which are central nodes in the reward circuitry. This release produces feelings of euphoria, relaxation, and pleasure, reinforcing the act of using marijuana. Over time, repeated stimulation of this system by THC can lead to changes in how the brain processes reward. With continued use, the brain begins to adapt to the presence of THC by reducing its natural production of dopamine and downregulating dopamine receptors. This means that the individual may experience less pleasure from everyday activities that once brought joy, a phenomenon known as anhedonia. To counteract this diminished reward sensitivity, the person may feel compelled to use marijuana more frequently or in higher doses to achieve the same pleasurable effects, a hallmark of developing tolerance. This cycle of tolerance and increased consumption can set the stage for dependency, where the brain starts to rely on external THC stimulation to maintain normal functioning of its reward pathways. Beyond the physiological changes, psychological dependency plays a significant role in marijuana addiction. Many users report using marijuana as a coping mechanism to manage stress, anxiety, depression, or social discomfort. While marijuana can provide short-term relief from these emotional challenges, it does not address the underlying causes and can sometimes exacerbate them in the long run. As reliance on marijuana to regulate mood or emotions grows, individuals may find themselves unable to cope without it, reinforcing habitual use. This psychological dependence can be particularly strong because marijuana's calming effects are immediate and often perceived as helpful, making it harder for users to recognize when their use is becoming problematic. Marijuana addiction does not always manifest in the dramatic ways seen with other substances, but it can still have profound effects on daily life. Those with dependency may prioritize marijuana use over responsibilities, experience withdrawal symptoms when not using, and find it difficult to reduce or stop despite wanting to. Withdrawal symptoms can include irritability, anxiety, sleep disturbances, decreased appetite, and cravings, all of which contribute to the challenge of quitting. These symptoms typically peak within the first week of abstinence, but can last longer for some individuals, making the recovery process both physically and mentally demanding. It's also important to highlight that addiction risk is influenced by several factors including genetics, age of first use, frequency and potency of marijuana consumed, and mental health status. Adolescents and young adults are particularly vulnerable because their brains are still developing, and early exposure to marijuana can increase the likelihood of developing dependency later in life. Genetic predispositions related to dopamine receptor sensitivity or stress response can also affect an individual's risk, as can co-occurring mental health disorders like anxiety or depression. Additionally, consuming high-potency marijuana products raises the stakes as they deliver more concentrated THC doses that can accelerate the development of tolerance and dependence. The social context around marijuana use also impacts addiction potential. In environments where marijuana is easily accessible, socially accepted, or even encouraged, patterns of heavy or frequent use can develop more readily. Peer influence, social norms, and cultural attitudes all shape how individuals engage with marijuana and their likelihood of developing problematic use. Conversely, social support systems, education, and access to mental health resources can mitigate these risks by providing alternative coping strategies and awareness. Treatment for marijuana dependency has evolved significantly and can be very effective when tailored to the individual. Behavioral therapies such as cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, motivational enhancement therapy, and contingency management have shown promise in helping individuals understand and change their patterns of use. These approaches focus on identifying triggers, developing coping mechanisms, and fostering motivation to maintain abstinence or controlled use. While there are no FDA-approved medications specifically for marijuana addiction, ongoing research is exploring pharmacological options that target the endocannabinoid system and neurotransmitters involved in reward and stress pathways. Understanding marijuana addiction is critical not only for individuals who use the drug, but also for healthcare providers, policymakers, and educators. With increasing legalization and normalization, it is essential to communicate the risks alongside the benefits, ensuring that people are making informed decisions. Addiction is not a moral failing or lack of willpower. It is a brain-based disorder that requires compassion, knowledge, and appropriate support for effective management. Ultimately, recognizing that marijuana can lead to addiction empowers users to monitor their patterns of use and seek help if needed. It also emphasizes the importance of prevention efforts, particularly among youth and vulnerable populations, and encourages ongoing research to better understand the mechanisms underlying marijuana dependency. This knowledge equips society to approach marijuana use with a balanced perspective, acknowledging its potential therapeutic benefits while being vigilant about its risks, including the real possibility of addiction and its impact on brain and body health over time.